When you hear the term filial piety, or Xiao, your mind probably jumps straight to East Asia, right? You think of this timeless tradition of duty to one's parents, something deeply embedded in Confucian culture. But what if I told you that's only half the story?
So, let's just dive right in with the big question. Is this intense family obligation really a uniquely Asian invention? For centuries, a lot of people have just assumed, yeah, of course. But you know what? The historical record tells a much more surprising and honestly a far more universal story.
I want you to meet Roman pieties. This wasn't just some nice idea. It was the absolute cornerstone of what it meant to be Roman. It was this powerful tradition of duty that demanded respect not just for the gods and for your country, but maybe most intensely for your parents. It was, for all intents and purposes, the Western world's original and incredibly powerful version of filial piety.
And this duty? Oh, it wasn't just a moral suggestion. No, it was backed by an ironclad legal concept called patria potestas, which literally means the father's power. And this gave the male head of a Roman family a level of authority that is just almost unimaginable to us today.
I mean, just look at this. This is how absolute that power was. A Roman father had the legal right to beat, imprison, and even sell his adult children into slavery. He controlled everything they owned. And under early law, he could legally execute them. In a lot of ways, this system was legally even more rigid, more absolute than what existed in early Chinese states. Pretty wild, right?
So, this sets up our central mystery. If both the East and the West started out with such powerful foundations of filial duty, how on earth did they end up on completely different paths? Why did the West pivot towards individualism, while the East seemed to double down on family obligation? That's the puzzle we're going to unpack.
All right, to understand this great divergence, we need the right tools. We have to get into the psychology of it. It turns out, not all filial piety is created equal. Modern psychology has actually cracked the code, and it reveals two very, very different dimensions to this powerful human emotion.
And this is it, the dual filial piety model. It basically breaks it down into two types. First, you've got reciprocal filial piety. This is the universal stuff, genuine love, gratitude, that heartfelt desire to care for the people who raised you. It's driven by affection. But then, there's authoritarian filial piety. This is all about hierarchy, obedience, and the obligation to suppress your own needs to meet your parents' expectations. This one is driven by a sense of should.
And this chart just illustrates the difference perfectly. When researchers compare different cultures, let's say Australians and Singaporeans, they find that the scores for that reciprocal, love-based piety are almost identical. The desire to care for our parents, it seems, is a human universal. But the massive difference is in authoritarian piety. That's where you see the scores are dramatically higher in East Asian societies.
So just take a second and think about your own family. Is your sense of duty driven more by that feeling of heartfelt affection? Or is it more of a structured sense of what you should do? Because that distinction, right there, is the key to understanding this whole divergence.
Okay, so we've got the psychological how, the difference between reciprocal and authoritarian duty, but that just leads to an even bigger question, right? Why? What historical, structural forces made that authoritarian piety so dominant in the East while it kind of faded away in the West?
Well, a huge piece of the puzzle is a concept from historical demography called the Hajno line. It sounds academic, I know, but it's basically this invisible line that for centuries divided Eurasia into two completely different zones of family life.
To the west of that line, in Northwest Europe, you generally had a pattern of late marriage. Couples would wait, and then they'd form their own independent, nuclear households. This really fostered individualism. But to the east of the line, which includes Asia, the pattern was totally different. Early marriage. We'd move into these large, multi-generational households. That fostered interdependence and group cohesion.
And this was all reinforced by agriculture. There's this idea called the rice theory, which suggests that the massive coordinated labor you need for rice paddy irrigation in the East just naturally promoted a more collectivist mindset. It makes sense, right? And this was a big contrast to the more solitary wheat farming that was common in Europe, which fit perfectly with the rise of that independent family unit.
But there's another layer to this story, and honestly, this one might be the most crucial. To really get why this system has been so resilient for so long, we have to look past virtue and psychology and see the cold, hard economic logic that made it work for thousands of years.
So here's the kicker. For most of human history, filial piety wasn't just a virtue. It was the most effective social technology there was for managing wealth across generations.
You can think of it as a living credit contract in societies that had no banks, no pensions, and no social security.
Here's how it worked. It's a simple three-step process. 1. Parents make a huge upfront investment of time, energy, and resources in their kids. 2. The children grow up and become productive. And 3. The children repay that investment by caring for their parents in old age. The family basically acted as its own bank and retirement fund. And that cultural virtue of filial piety, that was the powerful enforcement mechanism that made sure the loan got repaid.
And this is where the two paths really truly split. In the East, rulers actively promoted authoritarian filial piety because, well, it was a brilliant way to outsource the costs of social welfare. The family, not the state, was responsible for the old and the vulnerable. In the West, eventually the state took over that role. It created formal institutions, pensions, social security, which effectively freed the individual from that total economic obligation to the family.
So that brings us all the way to the present day, where these ancient systems are now colliding with the pressures of modern life, and it's creating enormous tension and some really serious, unintended consequences, particularly in East Asia.
For many women today, the traditional marriage package is still incredibly demanding. It can include a career, plus intensive mothering, plus a deep, lifelong obligation to care for her husband's parents. And this pressure is even more intense because, in a lot of places, a comprehensive state welfare system still just isn't there, leaving the family as the only safety net.
And the consequences of this welfare gap are stark. This tension between women's modern opportunities and these immense traditional duties is a primary driver of the demographic crises we're seeing in East Asia. I mean, we're talking about some of the lowest fertility rates ever recorded in human history.
So, as we pull all these threads together, you can really see two different models for society that have taken shape. One is built around the family as this economic and social fortress. The other is built around the freedom of the individual.
And you know, these systems are still evolving in fascinating ways. There's this modern irony called the daughter-centered reversal, where urban daughters are now often seen as more reliable caregivers than sons, totally flipping tradition on its head. And these ideas aren't just cultural echoes. They are still powerfully present in the legal system. In places like Hong Kong and Taiwan, judges still invoke filial piety to decide property disputes, sometimes ruling that a child's financial help was just a filial gift and not an actual investment.
Ultimately, I think it comes down to this really fundamental trade-off. The West dismantled the fortress of total family obligation in exchange for individual liberty, outsourcing security to the state. The East, meanwhile, is grappling with how to maintain the security of that fortress while the pressures of modernity are relentlessly pushing on its walls.
And that leaves us with a final and I think crucial question to reflect on in this huge historical divergence, where both paths have had clear benefits and profound costs. What do you think we've ultimately gained and what have we lost along the way?